it's going to be a long video because we are going for a very, very long walk. Sometimes walks are not just about traveling across spaces, but also traveling across time. Today, in this second video of the series on Mrs. Dalloway, we are going to look at the text itself. We'll study together, we'll read together the most important parts and try to understand how the consciousness moves and flows across the narrative. Don't skip any part of this video because I am sure this is going to be an experience you would remember. So stick with me as I explore with you Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. I usually don't give out spoilers, but with this novel, I'm going to make some exception. What kind of spoilers? You know, this novel is about a single day in the life of Clarissa Dalloway. But while living through this day, she gets back to her past a lot of times. We also get to look at the past of another important character in the novel, Septimus Warren Smith. So I thought it would be wise if we could actually have a sequence of events in lives of both Clarissa and Septimus before we begin the text, so that when during the narrative I take you back to these past lives, you will have no problem in understanding the context. So what is the past of Clarissa Dalloway? Let me take you back to a time when she was 18 years old and living in a place called Boughton. During the time, she was in love with a person called Peter Walsh. The other friends in her life were Richard and a person called Hugh Whitbread. During this time, in one of the summers, Sally Seton came to live with them in Boughton, and Sally and Clarissa fell in love with each other. What kind of a person was Sally? Sally was a free spirit. She smoked cigarettes, read socialist writers, and even ran naked through the house when she was bathing and forgot her sponge. So you can understand what kind of free spirit she was. Sally gave Clarissa radical things to read, and together they planned to change the world. And of course, Clarissa's old aunt found Sally shocking and improper. One night, Clarissa, Sally, Peter, another friend, they were together walking. Clarissa and Sally fell behind. Sally stops, picks up a flower and kisses Clarissa, and Clarissa is ecstatic. Really couldn't get over. But then that moment was cut short by Peter Walsh, who was possibly jealous. He asked if she was stargazing. Peter could not ever get along with Clarissa's father. Peter and Clarissa rode together on omnibus to tour London. They would walk in the woods, argue, discuss people. They had this intellectual relationship. And there is this particular incident which is of importance. Clarissa and some others were gathered around the table talking. Someone mentioned about a man who had married his housemaid, and Sally Seton said the housemaid had a baby before the wedding. Clarissa was shocked to hear this. But then Clarissa had been with free spirits like Sally and even Peter, who thought that Clarissa's shock, her reaction, shows her narrow-mindedness. That no matter what they conversed on, she was still a conservative person. But then Peter was in love with Clarissa. What to do? But he understood that Clarissa would never be his, because once he had already proposed marriage to her and she had declined. And he somehow understood that Clarissa was supposed to get married to someone else, and this person was Richard, who was also sitting with them at that table that day. It was that very night that Richard Dalloway had come to Boughton. Peter insulted Clarissa, calling her the perfect hostess. But he felt love for her, and she was kind to him even after this. One afternoon, Peter confronted Clarissa beside a fountain, and Clarissa told him that she would not marry him. Peter left Boughton that night. So this is Clarissa's past. she got married to Richard Dalloway. And now I want to give you the backstory of the other principal character of the novel, Septimus Warren Smith. So who is Septimus Warren Smith? Before the war, like the First World War, Septimus was an aspiring poet. He wanted to be like Shakespeare. He wrote love poems, and there was this person called Miss Isabel Pole who would edit his manuscripts, his poems, and he fell in love with Isabel. He worked in a private concern, something that begins with Sibleys and Arrowsmiths, and it was about real estate. Okay, so you can understand the drudgery of his office work because he was a poet. Mr. Brewer was Septimus's boss at the time, and Mr. Brewer was the managing clerk. He actually asked Septimus to play football so that he becomes stronger, healthier. So you can understand what kind of lanky figure Septimus must have had. And then World War I started. Septimus was enlisted. He went to France and he fought well. He got himself a name and he became very close to this officer, Evans. But just before the Armistice Day, that is the day when the war ended, Evans was killed. And Septimus suddenly felt blank and he thought that his soul had a fatal flaw. He was incapable of feeling. And that was the onset of post-traumatic stress disorder in him. While he was stationed in Milan, he met Rezia, is the short form of Lucrezia. Okay, so in the novel, sometimes we will see her as Lucretia and sometimes she will be referred to as Rezia, same person. Now, Septimus was very intelligent, clever. Okay, remember, he wanted to be a poet. So Rezia falls in love with him. Now, although Septimus was having this trouble with feeling things, he was not capable of feeling emotions, even then he somehow, convinced himself to get married to Rezia. They returned to England. In fact, he started reading Shakespeare again, but he found him filled with loathing for humanity. So the same books which evoked in him passion and emotion was now not capable of doing the same. And he felt the same about the other writers also. Rezia was a hat maker and she also wanted to have children. She wanted to have a normal family. But Septimus found physical intimacy abominable, hated it. And he also thought that it was very cruel to bring children to this bad world. He didn't want to pass his suffering on to his children. And his illness becomes more and more severe. So Rezia sent for the local physician, Dr. Holmes, to just check. Now, Holmes was not a professional psychiatrist. He just prescribed him to have hobbies and distract himself. And Septimus grew more and more suicidal. And he felt that death was something that was marked for him because of his fatal flaw. And it was then that Dr. Holmes suggested that they go and consult with a psychiatrist in London, Sir William Ragshaw. So this is the backstory of Septimus. Now let me just start the text, and I'm sure you will be less confused now when we go on flipping across time zones in the narrative. Look at the majestic beginning. Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. As soon as the book begins, we understand that this is going to be a third-person narrative where the narrator is not part of the character map, and therefore the narrator can see what is happening in each character's lives. But more than that, this narrator will be able to see what is happening inside the minds of the characters as well. So it's a special kind of omniscience that we are expecting from this narrator. From this first sentence, we get certain assumptions. We begin to understand a few things about this woman. First of all, she has certain rights and she has certain decisions under her control. She knows that she can buy the flowers herself. But why is she buy flowers? Why do we buy flowers? Either for a celebration or for a mourning, for a party where we celebrate life, or for a funeral where we express grief. What are these flowers going to mean? Let's see. For Lucy had her work cut out for her. So Lucy is the person who assists her at home, the maid. The doors would be taken off their hinges. Rumpelmayer's men were coming. So some kind of repairing was going on in her house. And then thought Clarissa Dalloway, what a morning, fresh as if issued to children on a beach. So Clarissa Dalloway is feeling exceptionally optimistic, and the moment she's talking about or thinking about the doors opening, suddenly that thought takes her back to a moment very long back in her past when she was actually opening the door or the windows in some other town. She goes back to her childhood in her thought. What a lark, what a plunge. This is the plunge. Plunge is when you dive into a pool and you're not in control of where you're landing. Our memories work just like that. There is a trigger in the present which takes us back to our past without us being a driving force here. Our memory takes us to whatever place it wants us. And where does her thought take her? Where does her consciousness take her? It takes her to her young days. She had burst open the French windows and plunged at Boughton into the open air. So this is no more London. And then we have this extra information for a girl of 18 as she then was. And then look at the expression here. Something awful was about to happen. Looking at the flowers, at the trees with the smoke winding off them, and the rooks rising, falling, standing and looking until Peter Walsh said, now we know who Peter Walsh is, right? So it's easier for you, right? So it was a day when she was having these thoughts in her mind back when she was 18, where Peter Walsh had said something to her. What had Peter Walsh said? Musing among the vegetables. So she was moving around the farmyard and Peter Walsh says that you're moving around the vegetables. Was that it? Now, you notice that the quotation mark ends with the word vegetables. So there we have the statement from Peter Walsh. And then we have this expression, was that it? That means she is not very sure at this moment that Peter Walsh had said exactly those words. But she has a vague memory of something like that being told by Peter about vegetables. And she had said, I prefer men to cauliflowers. Was that it? So, you see, you are looking at your own life and you're not sure exactly what you had said. And that brings us to the question of how much importance we give to our conversations, which will not even matter in the long run. And we spend our lives in all these silly little conversations, which we actually forget. Do you really remember what are the words you said to the person who has now become your best friend when you had met her 3 years back, 4 years back? No, because life is not just about remembering. Life is also about forgetting. But she remembers that she was with Peter Walsh. And then what has happened to Peter Walsh now? So she keeps on flipping between past and present. And now at present she is thinking consciously about Peter Walsh. And she thinks that Peter Walsh, he would be back from India one of these days. So now Peter Walsh is in India and he's supposed to come back. Like today, okay, when she has grown up and aged. At this moment, where is Peter Walsh? He is in India, supposed to come back. June or July, she forgot which, for his letters were awfully dull. So we also get this information that Peter Walsh, who was in love with her when she was young, is still in connection with her. He still writes to her, but the letters are dull, which means it doesn't excite her the way Peter's words excited her in her youth. It was his sayings one remembered, his eyes, his pocket knife, his smile, his grumpiness, and when millions of things had utterly vanished, how strange it was. A few sayings like this about cabbages. So all that she can gather in her memory. about Peter Walsh has amounted to these insignificant details. The important things like his smile, his words, those have vanished. Insignificant thing remains. So we are never in control of our memory. We are never in charge of our rememberings. So when this novel begins with a declaration like Mrs. Dalloway has decided that she is going to do something, we see that she is failing miserably in maintaining that control when it comes to things like memory and forgetfulness. Now I skip a paragraph to take you to some more description about her present situation. For having lived in Westminster, how many years now? Over 20. One feels even in the midst of the traffic or waking at night, Clarissa was positive, a particular hush or solemnity, an indescribable pause, a suspense. But that might be her heart affected, they said, by influenza. Notice this is in brackets. So if we ignore the parenthesis, we ignore this part written inside the first bracket, we'll just read like this: a suspense before Big Ben strikes. So this is the special quality of living in Westminster, where the Big Ben is located. It's a big clock that just before it strikes, somehow you can feel that it's about to strike. So it becomes a symbol of tradition and also the inevitable march of time. There, out it boomed. First a warning, musical, then the hour, irrevocable. Maybe there's a small bit of stirring sound just before the actual bell was rung in the clock. And the word irrevocable gives a sense of finality, that Big Ben has announced that this is the time and that's it. You cannot go back now. But is that right? We have just been to her past. 2 paragraphs previous to this one, we've traveled back in time. So traveling back in time is a possibility where the narrative follows the stream of consciousness and not any plot. Okay? The leaden circles dissolved in the air. Such fools we are, she thought, crossing Victoria Street. So she's thinking while she's walking. For heaven only knows why one loves it so, how one sees it so, making it up, building it around one, tumbling it, creating it every moment afresh. So she is confused that if time is so final, if you cannot do anything about it, then how can you actually plan so much for it or with it? And then we have some scattered description of what she's seeing around her, and that includes some airplanes flying above her head. In the triumph and the jingle and the strange high singing of some aeroplane overhead was what she loved. Life, London, this moment of June. Now, these aeroplanes overhead, these are also very significant because this was a time when London has just come out of the trauma of the war. And during the First World War, the airstrikes were really horrible in London. And right after she mentions aeroplane overhead, we come to the stanza which directly talks about the war that had devastated Europe. For it was the middle of June, the war was over, except for someone like Mrs. Foxcroft at the embassy last night, eating her heart out because that nice boy was killed, and now the old manor house must go to a cousin. So war was over except for someone like Mrs. Foxcroft. Who is Mrs. Foxcroft? This is a very, very insignificant character so far as this novel is concerned. But Mrs. Foxcroft is symbol of all those parents who had lost their children in the war. So maybe in the books of history, the First World War ended in 1919. But for these people, the war is still alive in their lives because it is still destroying them every day. The aftermath of the war. Or Lady Bexborough, who opened a bazaar, they said with the telegram in their hand, John, her favorite, killed. But it was over, thank heaven, over. It was June. The king and queen were at the palace, and everywhere, though it was still so early, there was a beating, a stirring of galloping ponies, tapping of cricket bats. Lords, Ascot, Ranelagh, and all the rest of it. And you notice there is hardly any full stop. I mean, it's going on, clause after clause, as if Mrs. Dalloway, while she's thinking about the war and trying to comfort herself, thinking that, okay, for some people the war might not have been over yet, but in general we can look forward to a peaceful life now. She is speaking, or rather she is thinking in clauses, as if she's trying to convince herself. While walking, she comes across her friend. I mentioned this guy very early on today, Hugh Whitbread. Now, what is the problem with Whitbread? He was an ambitious person who knew what he wanted in life, and Peter somehow hated him. Even Richard hated him. He was very clerical. Okay, so Clarissa, on the other hand, she really felt affectionate towards him. And here, while walking, she suddenly is interrupted by Hugh Whitbread. "Good morning to you, Clarissa," said Hugh rather extravagantly, for they had known each other as children. "Where are you off to?" "I love walking in London," said Mrs. Dalloway. "Really, it's better than walking in the country." What makes Mrs. Dalloway feel better walking in London? Maybe she loves the crowd, the color, the variety of life that is offered in London, the sound of London, which is so much absent in the country. Now, why is Mr. Whitbread here? He has come to visit the doctor, all right? They had just come up, unfortunately, to see doctors. Other people came to see pictures, go to the opera, take their daughters out. The Whitbreads came to see doctors. So that means somehow these Whitbreads, they were very cautious of their health, or they wanted to be very traditional about this, that I have to go and visit a doctor in a traditional way. Anyway, Evelyn was his wife, Whitbread's wife. Times without number, Clarissa had visited Evelyn Whitbread in a nursing home. Was Evelyn ill again? Evelyn was a good deal out of sorts, said Hugh. So Hugh says that yes, Evelyn is she's suffering from this and that every time. And then he continues to say that his wife had some internal ailment, nothing serious, which as an old friend, Clarissa Dalloway, would quite understand without requiring him to specify, perhaps something gynecological. Yes, she did, of course. What a nuisance. And felt very sisterly and oddly conscious at the same time of her hat. Now, perhaps this topic was not very comfortable for Mrs. Dalloway to continue with Whitbread, so she suddenly becomes conscious of her hat. So these are the gestures which show that she is not actually that interested in knowing about Evelyn. It's more like a friendly conversation she is enjoying. Not the right hat for the early morning, was it? So just now she was thinking about Evelyn, and now she's thinking about her hat. And that is what we all do too. Our thoughts and never stay focused on one single thing for a stretch of time. It wavers, it goes from here to there, especially when you're not studying. Okay, if you're studying, maybe you are focusing in a very conscious way, that is fine. But when you are just out walking, speaking to people, these trigger words somehow take you to very, very odd places inside your mind. And now she's thinking about her hat. Not the right hat for the early morning. So she was conscious about her appearance. For Hugh always made her feel, as he bustled on, raising his hat rather extravagantly and assuring her that she might be a girl of 18. So her hat was very, maybe, flowery and extravagant looking. And looking at that, Hugh said that you look like 18. And then Hugh also said he was coming to her party tonight. So this is where we get to know that she is hosting a party that day. Okay. And in the last line of this paragraph, you see, she knows that Whitbread is somebody who is not approved by either Richard or Peter. Though Richard was nearly driven mad by him, and as for Peter Walsh, he had never to this day forgiven her for liking him. She could remember scene after scene at Boughton. Peter, furious. So after her encounter with Whitbread, she remembers everything connected to it when she was young. What had happened then? Peter, furious. Hugh, not of course his match in any way. So it was not that Hugh Whitbread was a competitor of Peter Walsh when it came to the affection of Clarissa. Peter was a clear winner, but still Peter did not like her liking him. Okay. But still not a positive imbecile as Peter made out. So it was not that Whitbread was that bad like Peter made him. Not a mere barber's block. When his old mother wanted him to give up shooting or to take her to Bath, he did it without a word. He was really unselfish. Now she is thinking about Hugh Whitbread when he was young. But okay, he was an unselfish guy, a good guy. And as for saying, as Peter did, that he had no heart, no brain, nothing but the manners and breeding of an English gentleman, that was only her dear Peter at his worst. So it's like they hated Whitbread because he was so formal and traditional in the way he maintained his manners. So Hugh Whitbread was a butt of ridicule for them, and they could not understand why Clarissa was so kind to him. And then the thought sticks on with Peter. So it is Whitbread meeting whom makes her think of Peter. But then the moment she thinks of Peter, she doesn't come back immediately to the present. She stays there thinking about Peter. And what does she think? For they might be parted for hundreds of years, she and Peter. She never wrote a letter, and his were dry sticks. Earlier also she had said that his letters were dull. But suddenly it would come over her. If he were with me now, what would he say? Some days, some sights, bringing him back to her calmly without the old bitterness. Now we all know that when people break up, there's a lot of bitterness. But as time flies and maybe, they are 20 years after that incident, they don't look at that breakup with that kind of bitterness. They remember the nice things about those people. And this is what's happening now. The bitterness is diluted in her mind, which perhaps was the reward of having cared for people. They came back in the middle of St. James's Park on a fine morning. Indeed, they did. So these thoughts, they came back to her, thoughts about Peter. But Peter, however beautiful the day might be, and the trees and the grass and the little girl in pink, Peter never saw a thing of all that. What kind of a person was Peter Walsh? He was an intellectual person. He was not a person who was sensitive to his surroundings. Like, he was not a romantic. Okay, he was an intellectual, rational person. He would put on his spectacles if she told him to. He would look. Okay, if she said that, look, there's a beautiful rose, he would see. He would look at it. But it didn't come to him naturally. So there were two different kinds of people. And clearly we understand that Clarissa Dalloway was a more sensitive person of the two. He would look. It was the state of the world that interested him. Wagner, Pope's poetry, people's characters eternally, and the defects of her own soul. How he scolded her. So you see, she was always judged by Peter Walsh, and Peter Walsh detected these anomalies in her, these problems in her, as if he was diagnosing her. All right? How they argued. She would marry a prime minister and stand at the top of a staircase. The perfect hostess, he called her. So he hated the fact that Clarissa was a traditional person and she valued things like manners and customs, and somehow Peter constantly derated her for these kinds of preferences, and he said that you are just a perfect hostess. So demeaned her personality. She had cried over it in her bedroom. She had the makings of the perfect hostess, he said. And this is like making her feel inferior to him. And if this is not toxic masculinity, then what is? I have no idea. So, well, I can clearly understand why she didn't really want to marry this guy. But what about the person whom she actually ended up marrying? Was he any different? We'll have that knowledge too very soon. So she would still find herself arguing in St. James's Park, still making out that she had been right and she had to not to marry him. So it's like she knows that if she had married Peter, she would have always been under this scrutiny, this criticism, and lack of independence. So, what is her thought now? That is there any regret? Let's see what she says or thinks. For in marriage, a little license, a little independence there must be between people living together day in, day out in the same house, which Richard gave her, thankfully. So she has independence. Then what's the problem? And she, him, again, that very disturbing parenthesis or bracket begins. There is independence. But is this something she really wants? Because then she's thinking this. Where was he this morning, for instance? Some committee? She never asked what. So you see, yes, there is independence. But is independence really better? Where is the golden balance? Because here she's getting independent. She can go out and buy roses. Nobody is asking. And then she's thinking, nobody's asking. I am not asking my husband where he is. He's not asking me where I am. Is this the ideal marriage then? But with Peter, everything had to be shared, everything gone into. So if it was Peter, he would have expected her to tell him where she was going. And he would have told her where he was going. So now she's thinking, was that really bad or is this bad? And this is the fine balance or lack of it that we can notice here. And when it came to that scene in the little garden by the fountain, you remember I told you about the scene in the fountain. She had to break with him or they would have been destroyed, both of them ruined. She was convinced. Why did she say no? Because she wanted independence. She didn't want to tell her partner everything about herself. She wanted to celebrate some kind of privacy in her life. And privacy is something she never got with Peter. Though she had borne about with her for years like an arrow sticking in her heart, the grief, the anguish, and then the horror of the moment when someone told her at a concert that he had married a woman met on the boat going to India. So she let Peter go. But when she came to know that Peter is actually with a woman, another woman, it was too much for her. Never should she forget all that. Cold, heartless, a prude, he called her. So it's not that he was cold. She was always bothered about Peter. And while Peter was actually happy with his Indian wife, she continued to imagine that maybe that Indian wife is not up to the mark. So with Peter Walsh, we have a strange wave of emotion rising in her while she's walking along the road. And then she goes on thinking about her own self for a longer bit. She knew nothing, no language, no history. She scarcely read a book now except memoirs in bed, and yet to her it was absolutely absorbing all this, the gaps passing, and she would not say of Peter, she would not say of herself, I am this, I am that. Her only gift was knowing people almost by instinct, she thought, walking on. So the only capacity she had was actually being a hostess, actually understanding people, instinctively understanding how people are, what their nature is. She thinks that way, okay? And then she has this very strange thought that if I'm nothing, then will it really matter if I don't exist anymore? And these thoughts, which we have in Clarissa Dalloway, coincided disturbingly with Virginia Woolf's own. She herself must have felt all this and felt about life in these ways, the way Clarissa Dalloway is now feeling. And what does she think now? She remembered once throwing a shilling into the Serpentine. But everyone remembered. What she loved was this here. Now, in front of her, the fat lady in the cab. Did it matter then? She asked herself, walking towards Bond Street. Did it matter that she must inevitably cease completely? So, we make a big deal about death. Okay, that death is this, death is that. And people have written pages and pages of poetry on death. But does it really matter? Does life really matter? Does death really matter? Because she thinks all this must go on without her. Now, the Big Ben would keep on striking, like Virginia Woolf is actually dead, and the world is still going on the same way. So when she was thinking through Clarissa Dalloway that the world will go on without me, she was very much right. But does that make her life any less valuable? That is the important question here. Did she resent it, or did it not become consoling to believe that death ended absolutely? Because life sometimes it becomes too much trouble for people, especially when you have such truckloads of memory where you can't have any control on the exactness of that memory. You cannot guide yourself through your memory. It takes you unawares every time and you feel belittled. And then at least there is this consolation that when it will all be over, it will be over. Fine. So is that glorified here in any way? But that somehow in the streets of London, on the ebb and flow of things here, there, she survived. Peter survived, lived in each other. So yes, they did not live together, but she lived in Peter's memory. Peter lives in her memory. She being part, she was positive of the trees at home, of the house there. So she is not just a human being. She is also a part of other lives, other people's existence, other inanimate objects even. So you are not just you are part of your house. You're part of that house plant in your house. So this is where we finally see that it is not a celebration of death, rather a celebration of life. Rambling all to bits and pieces as it was, part of people she had never met, being laid out like a mist between the people she knew best. So you're part of everything. It's a strange kind of pantheistic feeling, like you are existing in everything around you. So if that is true, then no, death is not the absolute end, because if it had been the absolute end, Virginia Woolf wouldn't have existed today, Clarissa Dalloway wouldn't have existed today, but they exist today. Intensely, with all its power, survival is the key. But what was she dreaming as she looked into Hatcher's shop window? What was she trying to recover? What image of white dawn in the country as she read in the book spread open? Fear no more the heat of the sun, not the furious winter's rages, from which play by Shakespeare is from Cymbeline. It's a beautiful passage from Cymbeline. And the poem goes like this, where after your life is over, it's like you have collected all the taxes from life. Then golden girls and boys would all go back, just like the chimney sweepers do, to dust. So it doesn't matter how rich you are, how poor you are. Death is the ultimate leveler. Brings everybody down to the single experience of non-existence. And these lines, these two lines, will be like a refrain in our novel. You keep on repeating, and every time they are uttered in some different context, deepening the meaning every time. This moment, it is just a reference to a line she read in a book. So it's a big bookshop, and she thinks that she should buy a book for Mrs. Whitbread because she is in the nursing home. And then the scene shifts to the nursing home. So she reads these two lines, which I explained to you, in an open page. So it's not like she was reading Shakespeare's Cymbeline. She just happened to look at those words. And the book was open there in the bookstore. And she was also looking at other books. And then finally she goes to the nursing home. In the nursing home, she has interaction with Mrs. Whitbread. Here, I want you to look at this particular passage. especially about Richard. We have already known a lot about Peter. We are curious about Richard, right? Richard, who did things for themselves, whereas she thought waiting to cross, half the time she did things not simply for themselves, but to make people think this or that. Okay. Why do you do things? Suppose you do something good. Maybe throw a waste paper into the waste bin. Why do you do it? One reason is you think that is the right thing to do. And the second is that usually happens with me all the time. I want to impress people, make them feel that, oh, she is a good girl because she is doing the right thing. Okay. Maybe I like being appreciated. That's why I always ask you to comment and like and do things like that. It makes me feel less insecure. It makes me feel good. That is Clarissa's way of life. She does things to make people think something of her. But Richard does things because those things are to be done. He's very objective about those things. He doesn't care for other people's appreciation, other people's reactions, nothing. Right. And then there's a strange line that is written here, is coming in a thought. Oh, if she could have had her life over again, she thought. Stepping onto the pavement could have looked even differently. Some regret. She doesn't like her life. Why? What is wrong in this life? She would have been, in the first place, dark like Lady Bexborough. So she doesn't like her fair skin. She wants to be different. It's not that she doesn't like her fair skin. She says that at least I could be different. So this life appears to her as a non-productive one, and she cannot make anything out of it, and she wants to change it. And when you want to change your life after you are 45, 50, it means you are not very proud of the things you have already done. There's a lot of regret. And then she says, look at the things she wants to be. She wants to be like Lady Bexborough, with a skin of crumpled leather and beautiful eyes. She would have been like Lady Bexborough, slow and stately, rather large, interested in politics like a man, with a country house, very dignified, very sincere. But now, what does she have? She had a narrow pea-stick figure, a ridiculous little face beaked like a bird's. She feels insignificant. And all her life, because she does things in order to get appreciated from people. So what was Peter's diagnosis? That you are a perfect hostess, you are insignificant. And she carries this as the central core of her insecurity. She can never feel dignified because her personality was crushed early on by these harsh words by Peter. She comes to the glove shop after this, so you have to keep track of where she is going. Bookstore and then now this glove shop, where before the war you could buy almost perfect gloves. And our old Uncle William used to say, a lady is known by her shoes and her gloves. Now this is also important because ladies or women were valued for their appearances, for the way in which they maintained the ritualistic wearing of gloves and shoes and whatnot. So approval. She is always guided by approval of society, of the men around her. She had a passion for gloves, but her own daughter, her Elizabeth, cared not a straw for either of them. So Elizabeth is a daughter. So we are getting more and more information here. So it's not that stream of consciousness novel is all about what's happening inside the mind. It is also about giving you details of external events. That she's coming from one place to another, walking towards some other shop, thinking along the walk, things about her past. But still we have a plot progression that she is walking towards that flower shop. And usually gloves are representatives of the fashionable world. And the way she mentions her daughter makes us understand that the daughter is not interested in fashions. Okay. So that is again triggering a chain reaction. Not a straw, she thought, going up on Bond Street to a shop where they kept flowers for her when she gave a party. So she goes to the flower shop. And then she is going on thinking about her daughter. Elizabeth really cared for her dog most of all. So her daughter was more into dogs. But it might be only a phase, as Richard said, such as all girls go through. It might be falling in love. But why with Miss Gilman? Who is Miss Gilman? The Kilman was a tutor, a woman, a lady tutor, who was employed to coach her, Elizabeth. And somehow Mrs. Dalloway feels that Miss Kilman has a greater hold on her daughter than she herself has. And this kind of gives her very odd feeling that maybe my daughter is in love with Miss Kilman. And why does she think this is possible? Because she had been in love with another woman, Sally, remember, when she was 18 years old. So she knows this is a possibility. But the husband doesn't know of such possibilities, so he's just saying it's a phase. And what is Miss Kilman all about? She's all about simple living and lack of this fashionable life. Okay. And somehow Mrs. Dalloway feels that Miss Kilman is very much bitter as a person. So she feels very disturbed when she thinks of the growing affection between Miss Kilman and her daughter Elizabeth. It rests her, though, to have stirring about in her this brutal monster, and it's like she knows that the way she is thinking about Miss Kilman is not good. It is like she is harboring a monster inside her, a monster of hatred against Miss Kilman. So she is conscious of that. To hear twigs cracking and feel hooves planted down in the depths of that leaf-encumbered forest, the soul. So it's like she's very conscious of her feelings, whatever she's thinking, and then she wants to remove all these thoughts. Nonsense, nonsense, she cried to herself, pushing through the swing doors of Mulberry's the florist's. She advanced, light, tall, very upright, to be greeted at once by button-faced Miss Pym. So that was the flower storekeeper. And then the description of flowers. There were flowers. Delphiniums, sweet peas, bunches of lilac and carnations, roses, masses of carnations. There were roses, there were irises. Ah, yes. So she breathed in the earthy garden sweet smell as she stood talking to Miss Pym, who owed her help and thought her kind, for kind she had been years ago, very kind, but she looked older this year. So everything is based on Miss Pym's reaction. She thinks Dalloway is kind. She thinks Dalloway is looking aged. So Mrs. Dalloway's entire character, the way she looks at herself, is built on how people look at her. Okay. And note the long sentence with lack of pause and one idea flowing into another. The form becomes the content. It's like after that walk, she is now in a place where she can breathe. She can really feel the earthy beauty. All right. And then the horrible interruption happens. And as she began to go with Miss Pym from jar to jar, choosing nonsense, nonsense, she said to herself more and more gently, as if this beauty, this scent, this color, and Miss Pym liking her, trusting her. See, she's always happy when other people find her good, other people find her appreciable, and she's enjoying that moment where a wave which she let flow over her. So she was enjoying the time in that flower shop and surmount that hatred, that monster, and she could win that monster inside her, the monster which made her hate Miss Kilman. Surmount it all, and it lifted her up and up when, oh, a pistol shot in the street outside, a complete break from that reverie of happiness. The sound jars Clarissa out of her thoughts, which are like waves. And was it really a pistol? Mm-hmm. It sounded like a pistol. It was actually sound from a motor car. Dear, those motor cars, said Miss Pym, going to the window to look and coming back and smiling apologetically with her hands full of sweet peas, as if those motor cars, those tires of motor cars, were all her fault. So a tire probably exploded, and that sound was very similar to a pistol shot. And you have to remember why she thought this was a pistol shot. Perhaps post-traumatic stress from that Great War was not just in the minds of the soldiers, but also in the minds of the commoners. They were so much tuned to these sounds of weapons, noises, explosions, that any time an explosion happens, it jars them out. They think that a pistol is fired, a gun is fired. So, this flower shop might provide her with a momentary respite, but that pistol or the sound very similar to a pistol will always take her back to the moments of trauma where no matter if you were a soldier or a commoner, you were traumatized by a worldwide violence. And we will continue with our reading of the text and we will see how this violent explosion is connected intimately to the story of Septimus Smith. Till now, we were inside the mind of Mrs. Dalloway, and we will shift very soon to some other zone. So stay subscribed and turn on that notification icon because you don't really want to miss when I take up the next part of this text very, very soon. So till then, do let me know if you are enjoying our class, and if you are, then you can also share it with your friends. This is Monami Mukherjee signing off. Bye-bye.